Good evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Baer, Dean of the College of Forest Resources. On behalf of the college, I wish to welcome all of you to this three-part lecture series entitled Sustaining Our Northwest World. Our intent in this series is to highlight the dynamic balance we seek in meeting the growing natural resources needs of society while sustaining the environmental, economic, and cultural values we associate with our urban and wildland resources. This set of lectures is a companion to the college's Denman Forestry Issue series, also seen on UW-TV and the Research Channel. Both series contribute to the college's vision of world-class leadership in sustaining natural resources and environmental services, and both help prompt healthy scholarly debate in our college and throughout the region on ways to improve the lives of future generations while satisfying the needs of people today. In our college, we study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resources and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. We focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban ecosystems, and sustainable forest enterprises. Most natural resource decisions are complex, and many are contentious. Good solutions require that objective science be used to weigh the ecological, social, and economic consequences of decisions in order to meet the desired balanced result. All three values must be considered to achieve sustainability and to ensure the proper stewardship of our resources. The concept of sustaining our Northwest world is deeply rooted in the history of our college. Our newly transformed undergraduate curricula honor this tradition while simultaneously capitalizing on the competitive advantages we offer through our location in a major research university. We intend to produce the next generation of natural resource scientists, managers, and leaders who, along with you and other citizens, will ultimately be charged with sustaining a healthy Northwest environment, a dynamic Northwest economy, and the rich social and cultural heritage we all enjoy. Our college has long been recognized as a leader in forestry education and research, and as an integral part of the research enterprise of the university. We intend to build on these strengths by placing renewed emphasis on professional graduate education and research in areas of high impact to society. The ultimate goal is to ensure that our natural resources and environmental systems are sustained into the future. We are pleased to present this lecture series as a partnership between the University of Washington Alumni Association and the College of Forest Resources. We are also grateful for the support of the Rachel A. Woods Endowment, which is underwriting a portion of this series, and to the members of the college's Dean's Club for their unflagging support. Lastly, we are grateful for alumni activities with the college and encourage you to join the Alumni Association if you seek further involvement and want to stay connected.
The speaker for today's lecture is John Marsleff, Professor of Wildlife Science at the University of Washington. He received his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, his master's of science in biology, and his PhD in zoology from North Arizona University. John's research interests include studying the effects of forest fragmentation on the nest predators of the endangered marbled murrelet and a variety of songbirds in coastal Washington, understanding how to conserve birds native to the Pacific Islands, and studying how birds respond to urbanization. He believes strongly in cooperative research involving all stakeholders. One such effort is his active participation in a new graduate education program in urban ecology here at the University of Washington. The title of his lecture is Our Cities for the Birds.
So the goal of my talk tonight is really to try to distinguish those two aspects for you, to determine if cities are really positive for birds or if they're really negative for birds. And I must admit, coming into this, my feeling was that they were negative, and that nothing could be a stronger change of our land cover, natural land cover, than to pave it with cement. But in fact, the closer we look at the data, the more my students have studied different aspects of this urbanization phenomenon and relating it to birds, my ideas have changed a bit. So I hope to show you both sides of that equation tonight and let you decide and discuss with you whether cities really are for the birds in a crazy way or a positive way. So the effects that we're interested in are not just what's going on in the city, but how this sprawl might also affect birds. My colleague Marina Alberti and her students in the Urban Ecology Research Lab in Urban Design and Planning have shown us pictorially what's happened in the area around Seattle through time. This first image shows from 1900 to 1925 where there were parcels of varying degree of built land. And so the darker the blue on these images, the more building that occurred in that particular spot. And we'll just fast forward this through time a little bit here. From 1900 now accumulating up to 1950, you see again most of the urbanization occurring right in the downtown region, a little bit spreading out. By 1975, big jump and a lot more sprawl, what we call here the urbanizing fringe, which I live on right about here. And then by 2000, much more significant urbanization of the Seattle area. So again, our concern is, what does this mean for birds and other wildlife? Some of our other students, Lynn Robinson and Josh Newell, have looked at conversion of land cover on a small stretch in a very fine detail. And this is the area that's familiar to you all from Issaquah up to North Bend along I-90 here. And what they showed was that in 1974, when one of the first years we had really good satellite imagery and aerial photography of the area, most of the land cover here is what we coded as green, which is wildland. Very, very little human activity. It's production forest land. It's not wilderness, but it's not inhabited to any large degree. There was quite a bit of agricultural land, which we call rural, and there was a little bit of ex-urban land, this brown area, which is basically a little heavier settlement than a suburb, or sorry, little less settlement than a suburb, but still a natural forested background to it. It isn't converted to a artificial or an unnatural vegetation. It's still the natural forest vegetation, but a few houses poked in it. And that picture is dramatically different in 1998. Now, all of this agricultural area is suburban. There's suburban sprawl going on around even North Bend. And again, a lot of loss of agricultural lands that were there, and conversion of much of what was all green to now a mixture of green and brown, or that is ex-urban or amenity developments out in the forested areas. And as I was speaking with a gentleman here right before the talk, he again pointed out the great pressures there are to convert lands, forested lands, into light development. Okay, relatively large lots, but still a human imprint. And that's very obvious here. An increase in suburban lands from 74 to 98 of 756%, and almost a 200% increase in those ex-urban lands. And this is a pattern that's seen throughout the western United States now. It's not unique here to Seattle. One of the things that is most dramatic about it is the loss of interior forest. That is forest that, in our case, our definition was 200 meters away from some type of settlement. And in 1974, the green area here shows the distribution of interior forest in that study area. And it's almost completely gone in 1998. Small patches of it, most of it, fortunately, set aside by the Mountains to Sound Greenway, trust lands that occur there. So, back to the question, is urbanization really for the birds or not? When you look at this pattern of all this development and a few stringers of trees, it's hard to imagine that it could be. So I want to give you some insights today from long-term research that my students and I have been conducting in the area. I'll mention work by Rourke and the Caras, John Withy, Tina, Jack, and Dave as we go through the presentation. And I want to answer or address at least these topics for you. So give you some of the pros and cons of urbanization. I'm going to make the point that suburbs increase bird diversity, and then ask whether we just borrowed those birds and now we're having to repay that loan. talk a very little bit about things other than birds. And then, again, try to end up with some insights on why we should keep wildlife in our cities and how we can keep our cities wonderful. All right, so there's lots of negative things about settlement in terms of natural habitat, and a few of them are listed here. And the first obvious one is just habitat loss. And you can see on this image, lots of this would have all been forested, probably 50 years ago at the most. Now it's been replaced with grass and settled area. So there's loss of habitat. There's some perforation of the habitat here with ball fields, where forest is now not as connected as it was when that would have been all trees. There's other barriers and fragmentation that's created in the forest, like from this road here. There's probably exotic species that you can't see. There's probably cats and possums, raccoons, things that are crawling in from the houses. Kids with BB guns going into the woods to shoot things. Not that I ever did that. And then there's also the activity of people picnicking, hiking, biking, enjoying the woods also can degrade some of that habitat, specifically the understory. And urbanization differs quite dramatically from other land uses that we're more familiar about hearing the detrimental effects of. Things like timber harvest and agriculture don't really persist on the landscape all that long in most places. In the east, it's very obvious to see a lot of reforestation of agricultural lands in the east now coming back to forests because they're not being used as intensively anymore. Timber harvest is a relatively short change on the landscape. And in respect to how similar the habitat is in these particular activities to what was there naturally, timber harvest is usually pretty similar. Sometimes we have artificial tree plantations, but often we're harvesting native trees. Agriculture is certainly different. It can be quite different from the surrounding natural habitat, but urbanization is very persistent, and the habitat that's created there is very different from what was there naturally. So it stands out as potentially having a large effect. And not surprisingly, if you go and tabulate the reasons why species are listed as endangered under our Endangered Species Act, urbanization is number 2 on the list. And it's only led by the interaction of native species with non-natives, which of course also happens in urbanizing areas. So it's much more prevalent to see a species listed because of its interaction with our settlement than it is with things like ranching or other activities that we more commonly think of as very hard on the land. There are some benefits of settlement. I just listed a few here. Often we reduce predation. Climatic extremes are often lessened in cities because of the warming effects that we have. We oftentimes add water. We supplement feed for a lot of animals. We provide nest sites, novel nest sites. And there's increased edge and vegetative diversity. So there's increased diversity of the habitat as well. Usually we think of edge as being negative, but again, as we'll talk about in a bit, it doesn't have to be. So the approach of my students and I to look at how birds are responding to these kinds of activities, in this case urbanization, is to do a long-term study. We have several study areas where we mark individuals with unique color tags so that we can follow their lives, understand how they breed, how they survive, how they move, and relate that to things like the pattern of the landscape, the amount and type of settlement, other activities that we do. We measure things like demography, which is reproduction, survivorship, and dispersal of animals, and we then use that to understand what the population size of those birds are in respect to these factors, and then how the overall community of birds is assembled in respect to those factors. So I want to take you through some of these results. We've got study sites scattered all over the urbanizing areas, some quite urban areas around Seattle, and then several scattered out into the Cascades, up the major travel corridors. And our goal here is to look at a gradient, basically, from very urbanized downtown areas and less urbanized suburban areas, and still very wild ex-urban areas, those with very little settlement but a natural overstory. And we've selected our sites to vary on 3 main factors. The percent of forest land cover, and I'm going to talk about that a lot tonight. I'll show you lots of graphs that relate to how much forest is in a kilometer in an area within a kilometer of these study sites. And then the aggregation of forest, how clumped it is together, or is it fragmented? Because we think that might have effects on predation and the movement of animals. And then the urban patch size, the mean size of the urban, either the subdivision or the connected amount of concrete and buildings and that type of area that are in our study sites. So we try to look across those three factors and relate these aspects of bird reproduction and survivorship and movement to those factors. So here's the first result. And what we've got here is the number of bird species that we count. And my students will go out and stand for 10 minutes at a spot. At least this is what they tell me they do. I assume it's correct. Stand for 10 minutes and listen and see all the birds they can count, see, and hear within 50 meters of them. And we just count that number. We do it many times during the breeding season so that we have a good indication of what birds are there. And then we can just add up how many species of them are there. And we relate that across there's 54 points in that slide, or actually 57 with these controls. And then we relate it to the amount of forest within a square kilometer of that particular subdivision site. And we've got some of our points in the subdivision, right in people's yards and near the roads and things, and some in the forested fragments that remain in there. All of our sites have some forest fragment as well as a subdivision. And this is the result. There's very low diversity in the most urban subdivisions we looked at, those with hardly any forest cover. That's not surprising. I mean, you're going to get things like crows if you're lucky. You're going to get some pigeons and starlings and maybe some gulls, maybe some other sparrows in this area. And they're also very low in the forested reserves. What we think of as the mecca for conservation biology, the big, large reserves of forest, are very low in diversity of birds during this time of the year, during the breeding season. It's true this time of year. It's even worse now in the winter. I went out to some of these sites last week and I got 5 or 6 species. And these sites, again, you get 5 or 6 species. What's surprising to us is this. The greatest diversity is where you have about 50 to, or let's say 40 to 60% forest cover. That's my backyard. Okay, that's a subdivision of fairly light settlement out on the urbanizing fringe, around North Bend, around Bothell, around Issaquah. Some of those areas still have considerable forest cover, but interspersion of built and forested lands. And at my yard, this morning I got about 14 species. You know, much more than I would get downtown or out in a forested reserve. So that's kind of surprising, and I want to investigate that with you a lot so we can understand what it really means. The way we've been investigating this is to look at 2 factors that contribute to the number of birds in an area. The first is the extinction of forest birds. So that's what we've got plotted here. And this is what we've actually got as the number of native forest species, those that should be found, those ones that are found in those forested reserves. How many of those are retained in these other sites? And as you can see, the number retained increases with the percent of forest. So in these highly forested areas, there's our 3 reserve control sites, we get about 15 species. That's all there is. That's all of the forested songbirds that we can accurately survey with our methods that you get. And we get most of them in those sites. When you get down to an area here with very little forest cover, you get very few of those. You lose about 10 of the 15 species when you decrease forest cover. But when we're up here around 50%, we still have most of those 15. There's some variation, but we've got most of them. So if we look again at, we now put aside the extinction for a little while and look at the colonization of these habitats, the opposite of extinction, adding species to it. What we see is an increase in the colonization of our sites as we increase the amount of forest up to a point, and then it declines. And these birds now are what we call early successional species, the ones that like fields and young forests, clear cuts, early successional, early part of the forest successional series. And this is your $10 word for the night, synanthropic species, those that like people, that live with people, okay? So if you look at those animals now, not the forest-dependent ones, but the ones that like us and that like clear cuts and young forest and brush, things like that we're good at making, their numbers increase up to a point where we've got kind of a mixture of forest and fields. And then they start to decline again down here. So this colonization curve looks a lot like the overall curve of diversity that I just showed you, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, people would argue that the birds that are coming in to these young forests, these brushy areas, these clear cuts, they're garbage birds. That's what they always tell me. Who cares about these things? They're not important birds. And sure, there are some birds, some of the synanthropic birds, or the ones that really like people, are ones that are very easy to manage for, the ones that are very familiar to all of us. They come in very quickly, things like the American crow, Buick's wren, starlings, and house finches, and even house sparrows and some of the gulls come in very quickly to human activity. But there's a whole bunch of other species, some that I've pictured down here for you, that really benefit from this mixture, again, of young forest and older forest if it occurs in a sufficient size. Things like chestnut-backed chickadees and nuthatches, black-throated gray warblers, northern flickers, black-headed grosbeaks, olive-sided flycatchers, white-crowned sparrows, Swainson's thrush. Those are neat birds. Many of them are sensitive birds in our area, and many of them rely upon this mixture of young and older forest. And that's part of the peak that we were talking about here with respect to most birds being around 50% forest cover. And this isn't anything new, okay? There are two people, if you're a biologist, that you have to go back and look for to see, that they've already figured this out. One of them's Darwin, and the other one's Aldo Leopold. And Leopold knew this. He had promoted making edges and a diversity of habitats for a long time. Back in the 30s, he wrote this game management book that was very important. And lots of our deer managers and grouse and quail managers have tried to create as many edges as they can. And of course, we're concerned about that for some species that need interior forest conditions. But what I'm telling you tonight is that that same principle, what Leopold called the law of interspersion, having a lot of different habitat types close together, increases diversity, absolutely. And it increases diversity in our urban areas and suburban areas of some pretty neat birds. Things like those olive-sided flycatchers or willow flycatchers and grosbeaks. So if we put this together, here's our overall curve that I first showed you, the overall diversity with respect to percent forest. Here's the extinction curve, which doesn't affect the shape of this very much. And what's really driving the number of birds and the diversity of birds in the urbanizing and suburban areas is this colonization curve. That's that thing that's related to those young forest birds, those clear-cut birds, those synanthropic birds that like us. That's what's causing the abundance in the middle of the percent forest area to be so high. Some of our research has been trying to understand whether this is a causal relationship or just some fortunate correlation that we got. And so we've looked at subdivisions, and this is an easy thing to do in our area, as you know. There's a lot of subdivisions built every year. And so we've gone out and found subdivisions before they were being built and monitored birds in the forests that were there and then follow them through time to see how they change with respect to building. And now we're going into our 6th year of these experiments. So we'll now start seeing how the birds respond to increased use of the forest by kids and cats and things like that. But I want to tell you a little bit tonight about these first few years of looking at this. And I'm going to do that by contrasting the bird abundance in some control sites, some low-density developments, and some high-density developments. And I'll show you some pictures of those. So here's our high-density settlement. This is out on Redmond Ridge. Some of you may know this area. And this was what the site looked like in 1999. And these green dots are our survey points. Okay, and we've got some survey points in here that were still in forest when they were just starting to clear the land for this big planned development out up I-90. And then we had some that were already in areas that were cleared. And then this is also a control site, the watershed for the city that's close by. And you can see that there's a nice set of points in a very forested area. And then in 2001, those control sites, they haven't changed much. They're still nice forested points, but our development has increased dramatically and taken a lot of our points that were forested here. Now they're in this development. And here's what we consider a low-density settlement. This is up above North Bend, looking out over the valley. Beautiful spot. It's a neat area, and our sites here, the green dots again, there hasn't been a lot of change from 1999 to 2001. Little bit of increased development there, but for the most part, these low-intensity developments punch holes in the forest. They don't remove a lot of the forest, but there's increased human presence there. There's roads, there's people, there's planting and some landscaping occurring in the yards. So we're curious to see how this low-density development contrasts with the high-density development, and we have some controls to see what effect may in fact be natural. So we had some predictions about what species should increase and decrease and stay the same. And this panel shows you 4 species that we expected to decline. And in fact, they did, which was a good thing from our perspective, not from their perspective. So what we have to see the decline is the control sites in green. And this is after starting in 99 again. Here's all of our the control and low density and high density, all having about the same number of winter wrens, right? That's what these show. And the error bars, these little whiskers, just indicate the variation from site to site of the same type, okay, whether it's a high density, a control, or low density. And you monitor those for 5 years, and you see that through time, these high density sites basically drop out with respect to winter wrens. And the low density sites and control sites especially maintain their abundance of winter wrens. So winter wrens, they're a really neat little species. They live in the understory, they like it dark, they like it moist, and they like lots of downed material for them to build their nests in. And these animals just drop out when we develop an area, even after only 5 years. Similarly, Wilson's warblers over here, another awesome bird of the Northwest, nice yellow with a black top. They drop out. They maintain in the control areas, but not in the highly developed areas. These are ground nesters. Brown creepers like dead trees with flaking bark that they crawl under to put their nests in. And they don't drop as dramatically, but still they're more abundant in the control than the urbanizing sites. And likewise, Pacific slope flycatcher, not as striking a drop, but still less abundant in both kinds of development relative to the control. There are other species that increase, and they do this quickly. And it's only 5 years since they started building these areas, and starlings are starting to increase, especially in the high-density developments. Crows, there are some benefits of urbanization, and this is clearly one. We increase the number of crows, and people can enjoy those. Violet green swallows increase dramatically. They're aerial foragers. And this is a species, again, this is not a garbage species. This is a neat bird, it's a native species, but it needs open areas to forage for insects, much like Steve's bats that he talked about last time. They need open areas, and when we put in subdivisions, we make those conditions for swallows. And chickadees also, black-capped chickadees, which are more of a deciduous species, tend to increase. The type of development matters more to some species than others, and that's just shown here for a couple of species. The first one is black-throated gray warbler, and black-throated gray warblers were most abundant in the low-density development. Now again, it's only been 5 years, that may change, but for right now, they've been very abundant in those low-density developments. Chestnut-backed chickadees also in the low-density development, more so. They're especially tied to conifer overstories, so those are maintained there much more than in the high-density development. House finches, they like high-density developments. And what's interesting with house finches is they'll colonize an area, then they'll go extinct. They'll colonize, they'll go extinct. They'll stay extinct, and then they'll come back. And I'm expecting the next couple years they'll really take off in some of these more urban areas. And they use our planters and old Christmas wreaths and things like that to nest in on your door. All right. So we've got these species that are causally responding to urbanization. And the question now is, I've shown you that their diversity is highest in these subdivisions. But is that just an artifact that we've only been looking in relatively new subdivisions? And maybe they'll drop out over time. They'll go extinct there. So Kara Ianni has been working on this question. And basically what she's trying to do is to explain this high peak and the variation around it. See, we've got some sites that have a lot of birds, about 35 species, and others that are similar with respect to forest, that only have, about 22 species. And so our idea was, well, maybe those are older, and the birds have gone extinct through time in there. And so this good news of suburbanization being good for birds is short-lived. So let's look at first the early successional species and see how they respond. And what Kara has shown here is that their numbers do decline through time. Okay, here's the age of the subdivisions, a whole new set that she looked at. And these range from very young to about almost a century old, 90-year-old subdivisions, that all were in this suburban area, okay? So the landscape around them is fairly similar. They have gotten a bit more urban through time, but for the most part, they're suburban areas. And the early successional species have started to drop out. And that's because, again, the forests and the other trees planted there are growing. And they're closing in the canopy. And they're making things not so good for swallows and other species that respond to those open areas. The forest species also decline. Okay, the red line indicates a drop in the number of those forest species through time at the sites that were out in the ex-urban area. The areas here that were in a much more urban setting to start with, they didn't have many native species at all in them to start with. They had already dropped out of there. But these ones that are out in the more ex-urban lands, they had quite a few of the native forest birds when we started. And as those subdivisions, as we looked at older and older subdivisions, the abundance of those birds were less and less obvious. But again, after almost a century of change, the end point, okay, here's the total species now. The end point is still around 25 or so species, which is right here, right in the middle. So even after a century of losing some forest birds, losing some of these other early successional species, we still have a lot of species there. You have to imagine with me that there's a line actually that goes right down here, okay? And this line is the total number of species, and it ends up right there about where my arrow was pointing to the end of it, showing that the balance in these areas, in these suburban areas, remains positive. And that is, we still end up with about 25 species, as I just told you, overall. That comes about by three different things. One, you've got some interest paid by this development, and that is you create some new habitat for these synanthropic birds, and they increase. They weren't there before, it was forest. Now you've got them, and you've got about 5 species that stay there. The forest species, on the other hand, started off at about 15 to 20 of them, and they do decline, especially in these ex-urban sites through the first 50 or so years. And then at the urban sites, again, they were already very low, and they remain low there. So we have some kind of a debt that accumulates over the first, let's say, 50 to 60 years of a subdivision in the loss of those birds. And we also had a loan in these early successional species. They were not very abundant, maybe in some of the forest openings that occurred naturally. They increased, and then they gradually declined through time. But in total, on balance, there's more species there, and it's a mixture of forest species, early successional species, and human-associated species. So it's an interesting mix. It's not just garbage birds. Not that there are any garbage birds, of course. So my question is really, can we do any better than that? I mean, that looked pretty good to me, but can we do better? And perhaps by knowing why some of these forest birds especially, or these early successional ones decline, we can suggest how to lessen that loss. And so we looked at things like reproductive failure, especially nest predation, because the dogma is that as you put in houses and you have cats and kids and all the other things, and crows especially, that come in and eat other birds' young and eggs, that their abundance will decline. Perhaps there are some problems with moving through this built matrix, so some problem with dispersal, or maybe survival is low, or maybe just population sizes are small and habitats poor. So let's look at those factors. The first one is nesting success. This is a bush tit. Cool little bird, about that big, all gray, builds this amazingly complex nest out of moss and other lichens and things, big hanging nest, and they're colonial, cooperative birds. They live in flocks of, up to 20 or 30 birds. See them flitting around. And if you ever find a nest like this, it's just amazing to watch. You can be sitting next to this thing and it's all quiet, and all of a sudden the adult comes in like this, and this thing just erupts with chipping and churring, and the whole thing's moving around. Just a really neat sight. If you look at across all these different kind of species, here's the synanthropic ones, the ones that the woodpeckers and things that nest in cavities, the wood ducks, wrens, species that just nest in shrubs, like some of the thrushes and robins and other shrub nesting species, ground nesters like towhees and juncos, and then just robins by themselves, because we had a pretty good sample. This is just for the first 3 or 4 years of just robin nests. If you look across the board, this is good nesting success. Okay, most nests fail if you're a bird. And in our case, we're right about 50% or above success for birds nesting of all these nests we found in the urban areas. So they're not being preyed upon disproportionately like we had at first suspected. they're doing what birds do everywhere, and that is there's a lot of reasons birds fail. Robins, you know, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a real decline in robins, even though they have the lowest nesting success of the species we've looked at. That's because they'll re-nest up to 4 or 5 times in a year to pull one brood off, and that may be all they need to do to be successful. So we've also looked very carefully at predation, and this is some work that John Withey has been doing, looking at the occurrence of predators in some of our sites. So let me walk you through this graph a little bit. Notice the color scheme. I'm hoping it'll do something for the game. So the blue contours, what this is like looking down at a topographical map. Okay, and the white areas here are the peaks of the map, and the blue areas are the troughs. So the peak here is an area where John and Jordan, when they were out counting crows, they saw lots of crows there. So this is an area of high crow abundance. And here's another area of high crow abundance. And it's interesting, there's a woman we figured out that lives right here that feeds crows all the time. I live out over here, so I'm not contributing to this image. Then the yellow or gold here, those are all the predators within our site, and the sites are indicated in red. This is Lee Forest, for those of you who know the area, and this is a new subdivision out by Lee Forest. And so this is our study area, and as we walk through it and look for birds and do our other things, we mark down every time we see a predator, and that could be a squirrel or a chipmunk or a hawk or a crow or a jay. We mark all those down, and then you can see big peak areas of all those species as well, kind of at a finer scale. And you can ask whether that has anything to do with nesting success. And so here we've plotted in red the nests that failed, and in green those that succeeded. And here's a big peak of predator abundance, right where you've got successful nests and failed ones. And likewise all through here, there's no consistent difference. And if you go and actually ask, what is the altitude, if you want to think of it that way, what's the height of that predator mountain? We're at the nest, and take the average of those. They're basically the same at failed nests and successful nests. And this is just for shrubs. That was the best, that was the strongest relationship. And it's actually the inverse of what you'd expect. More predators where there's more success. Okay, they're probably all keying in on good things in the same area. We can go and also do the same thing with just territories of birds and not have to find the nest, but we can monitor the territories and ask whether that pair of birds produced any fledglings or not. Again, red is bad, green is good, and I don't see any distinct pattern here. And if you look at, this is the Monterre site here, again, they're more likely to fledge where there's lots of predators, and in the big forested area, Lee Forest, it's the same. So we're just starting to do this kind of work. We've got lots of other sites to do this on and understand if there's any basic patterns. But our first glance is that, no, there isn't. Well, how about barriers to movement? Cara Whitaker's been looking at movement of radio-tagged young birds to see if they perhaps have trouble moving in the built area around our forested places. Here's a robin, a young robin, that has trouble moving at this point. He's been killed by a hawk, and he's going nowhere. But what Cara sees, again, at an initial first look at the data, we just started this pilot work last summer. In 26 fragmented sites, the likelihood of a bird returning and being recaptured in those sites is higher than in the control sites, the more forested sites. Now, this might mean that these birds are piling in there and not moving out, or it might mean that they're good spots. I think they're probably piling in and not moving out. We're just getting a feel for that. Here's some movements of robins. Again, this is that same area I just showed you. Here's the Lee Forest, and this was that Monterre site. And these little robins are pretty amazing animals. And so, again, we caught some of these and put small radio transmitters on them and followed them around. And their tracks are shown here by the arrows and lines. So here's where Jack and Dave and I caught a young robin, and that sucker took off. Man, he goes all the way up here and around and back and forth and down here. And this answers the question, at least, how a robin flies, right? It's not a straight line. I wasn't going to show the data, but crows don't fly in a straight line either, just in case you're wondering. The green here is another robin taking off, cruising out through the matrix at will. In fact, they went off the air where we could afford to buy satellite imagery. So they're cruising 4 to 6 kilometers away from this site, right when they're getting out of the nest and starting to move. So, of course, robins they're robust through the urban environment. We wouldn't expect them to have a problem. Here's a towhee, spotted towhee. There's another one down here. And they don't move nearly as far. They stay right in the forest, but they've survived, and we're just, again, getting a feel for the survivorship of these animals and for the movement ability of them through these different areas. Here's some movements of banded individual song sparrows just going from territory to territory. These are adult breeders. Here's a pair that started here, and the male went down to this territory the next year. His female stayed. I don't know who made that choice, but he had to go there. And there's another one that moved. But most of these animals stay in the same site or very, very close to it, okay? And they do very well in those sites. Now, just for Steve, I've got to comment that I'm bird-focused. Birds can move easily. They can get through different areas without much trouble, and it may not be the case for mammals, okay, for small mammals in particular. And so what we show here is just the number of small mammal species as a function of land type. So our exurban or more wild sites to the urban. And what you see here is a more dramatic change, and that is the place where we caught most of the native species here in black. Things like this shrew mole, which is just awesome. Catch these guys primarily in exurban sites. And you don't catch very many native species as you get more and more urban. Instead, you catch rats. Deer mice rule the suburbs. They are super abundant. Wow, that's an interesting color. Okay. So it doesn't look like predation is all that big of a deal at the present time. Perhaps for some species, moving might be more of a problem than for others. How about just overall population size? And this is some work that Tina Blewett did, and what Tina found is that the population size of birds in our study sites, okay, the reds and greens, is much lower, and these are all the cavity nesters, woodpeckers and things, much lower than the yellow bars, studies done by colleague Dave Manuel and one of his students earlier in a forested area. So population sizes in these urban spots probably are considerably smaller. And habitat is probably not as good. And that's shown, let me focus you on this graph here, and this just shows, again, with respect to age of development, what proportion of the ground cover is exotic. And it increases. More and more exotic land cover as the development ages. And you can take my word that this graph shows that as those built and wild areas are more like this, interspersed instead of like this, that also the abundance of those exotic species increases. So that's quality habitat, probably especially for some of these small mammals, but also for things like Wilson's warblers and winter wrens. The diversity of vegetation also declines. As you get greater proportion of forest, you get greater diversity of especially trees and also some of the ground cover. So the diversity of habitat, the amount of the size of the population are probably important things that may be driving this relationship. The other factors we're starting to understand, they don't appear to be very important now. Not willing to say that they're unimportant completely, but we're starting to get a feel for it, and that could then focus us in terms of conservation efforts on things like this. How do we improve these things to make it better for some of these forest birds, rather than focusing so much on these, which, to be honest with you, when I came into this, that's what I was focused on. All right, so is Seattle just unusual in this respect? It's a young city. It's got abundant forests and big reserves nearby. Maybe that's all that's going on, is we've got lots of birds that keep coming in and out. It's got a pretty mild climate. And it's got a relatively simple bird community. You know, there isn't the diversity of species here in the breeding community that we have in lots of other deciduous forests in particular, and warmer areas. So let's talk about some of the things we can do, assuming that Seattle isn't all that unusual. And I can tell you that there are other studies that show similar types of results. What can we do to keep birds a little more abundant here? Vivek needs to get back in here. We could restore areas. And there's a variety of things that our studies have suggested that could be done to help with restoration. Again, keeping forest cover around 50% helps for a lot of reasons to keep forests more connected. Keeping tree density in a particular area above about 10 per hectare, or about 5 per acre. Native understory and retaining snags, I think, are critical elements. Again, that gets at the degradation of forest cover, and forest understory cover in particular. And you're going to have to work with your neighbors, as hard as that can be at times. because your one small lot isn't going to probably be enough to do a whole heck of a lot for birds, and we really need neighborhood groups. And a lot of them exist now that manage collectively very interesting green spaces. And those can have very significant bird value if some of these things are done. And this is my slide that just shows to remind you, if there's one thing you do, go and take out some of your lawn. Okay, cut out. This shows a more progressive kind of yard where you've got lots of shrubs and trees and things like that, and you've reduced the amount of lawn, which means you have to mow less, which I think is important. It will improve your life quality by mowing less. And you'll have more shrubs for birds, especially if they're native shrubs. So let's draw a couple other lessons from these cavity nesters. And the reason I wanted to focus on cavity nesters for a little bit is that they're the ones presumed to be very sensitive to development. They require dead trees, just like the bats that Steve talked about. And those are some of the first things to go in urban areas because we don't like dead trees in our yard. I do, but not everybody does. So what we found, again, Tina's work showed that some of these cavity nesters, the chestnut-backed chickadee, hairy woodpecker, and pileated woodpecker, needed areas with the highest amount of forest. About, in a square kilometer area that we were studying, about 60% of that area needed to be in forest to get these species in reliable numbers, especially these later two. Other ones didn't require that. They required increased interspersion. So these were Aldo Leopold's birds, okay? Black-capped chickadees and flickers, nuthatches, and some of the other woodpeckers. They like the interspersion of built and forested land. And so the implication is pretty simple. And this is the rule. After you go and remove some of your lawn, remember this. Don't do the same thing everywhere. If you don't do the same thing everywhere, you'll have diversity of landscapes. And in respect to planning and our urban development on the fringe, some of these areas that have fairly large reserves are going to be necessary for things like pileated woodpeckers and brown creepers to be very abundant. You'll still get them in the other areas, but they'll be rare. Planned developments that have a lot of interspersion are going to benefit some of these other species. So as long as we don't do the same kind of development everywhere, I think there's room for a lot of bird diversity. And you have to learn to embrace alder. As much as people don't like alder, it is very important to these cavity nesting species because it grows fast and it dies fast. And when it dies, it leaves nesting cavities and other areas that these birds can use. All right, you ready for this now? So, what we need to do is, in my opinion, get people to value wildlife more so that we can use them in these sustainability equations more effectively. We're not going to have every species we'd like in the heart of the city. Certainly we're not. But we can still have a lot of species there. And by having them there, we can have people encounter them more and build a more positive, ethical relationship with them. And this is a natural progression. Nash's work here just shows that through time, you're going up through time here. We started off just valuing ourselves, of course. We still value ourselves a lot. We've increased to value most humans, I wouldn't say all, but most of them at this point, and some animals. We're really not valuing plants and life in general and things yet. Some value the universe and planets more, but most of us are right in here valuing humans and some sentient animals. And this is where we need to increase, basically, and become more and more, have more and more value for these other forms of life and the planet. And I think, personally, the way to do that is to have stronger contact between animals and wildlife and people. This is why we need crows. I've been good. I haven't mentioned crows much. And having one nice thing, an advantage of the city, and even though you might not be living where there's a great diversity of birds, you at least live in an area where there's some very important culturally stimulating birds. And those are crows and their friends, the ravens. And this is just a quick drawing from my friend Tony Angel, who has shown through time how crows and ravens have influenced our culture. So here they are scavenging in the Pleistocene and before people were around, scavenging great kills. And then here they're starting to steal food from some of the Native Americans. And because of that battle back and forth, we think that some of the culture and worshiping of this incredibly deft animal had occurred in response to this. But it also occurred in Norway as the Norse god Odin had ravens that would go out and tell him about the world. And the Tower of London, they never let the ravens out because the whole kingdom would collapse if they did. The plague doctors looked like ravens. Lots of influences on our culture because we had close association with these animals. And fortunately, we still have close association with crows, and we name our rock bands for them, and we have cool movies about them, and some of us hunt them, and they forage on our picnics, and eventually they live and then die probably of West Nile virus in our cities. But they've stimulated us for a long time, so even if we don't have the highest diversity of birds, we certainly have some good ones to deal with. But there's a double-edged sword in this, and that is, how long will people tolerate increasing populations of crows like we see in Seattle here? There comes a point, and they've reached it in Tokyo and in Singapore, that there comes a point where people no longer culturally get stimulated by these in a positive way, and then they start hating them and shooting them and having negative responses to nature, which I don't think would probably help our ability to solve things in a sustainable way. So it's a very interesting balance in this urbanizing area where some species do very well, can stimulate us, but maybe overstimulate us. So, if we really want to do management in these urban areas, we need to be able to work with a variety of different people. We need to work with people that are interested in developing areas and interested in living in them and interested in conserving the organisms that live in there. And that's challenging. This slide shows the challenge, okay? These are some of the strategies that we've come up with of things we could do for birds. And I don't care that you see all these. I want you to see that to employ any of these, you've got to deal with a whole host of different people. Very different backgrounds, philosophies, values. And to be able to effectively do things like setting aside open space, you've got to deal with a variety of them on different scales. Okay? And to do effective things for bird conservation is going to require us to work together. Gordon Bradley and Ann Kearney have surveyed lots of residents in the Seattle area, and they found that having access to open space is very important to them. They can tolerate density better the more access they have to open space, and they have a stronger feeling of community when they have that access. But these variety of opinions can be dangerous also. And I want to have you think about this graph. Here again is your famous graph of the abundance of bird species as a function of percent forest. And what's going on is I think different aspects of our community are selecting for perhaps different aspects of percent forest. So developers and homeowners are selecting for an area that's kind of far down in terms of more development, less forest. There's a lot of variation there. Conservation planners typically push us the other way. We're going for the big green, big open, big reserve parks and things like that. And so birds are right here in the middle, left in the middle to just by chance will we create these conditions that are suitable for a great diversity of birds. And we're doing that now, but I think it would be a lot better if we planned it and we made sure we had some of these areas, some of these areas, and some of these areas, because they're all using different birds and they're all responding to human needs differently. So this planning is incredibly important, and it's very obvious when you see that if just left to random chance, it's pretty easy to go to a place on that previous graph where bird diversity is low, and then human health and well-being and cultural stimulation will be low. So some of the other things we need besides that planning, we need local data. We're just starting these kinds of studies, and we need new educational and research approaches that really engage folks like you that are here. And we're starting to do some of that differently. Bruce mentioned just briefly our urban ecology program here. Several students from that program are here. They've been the ones doing the work that I've been telling you about. They're the ones that are planning students that are working with biologists now together, writing their dissertations together, trying to live together, trying not to kill each other while they go through that process. But the result is that there's much stronger looks at how we integrate planning issues, human economic issues, and wildlife concerns. That's happening here. It's also happening at Arizona State. There's lots of interesting now urban ecological research in Baltimore and Phoenix. And I just want to leave you with the last thought here. There's been lots of other suggestions about the vision of cities, and you might have heard of the city beautiful. And I would like to leave you with an idea of the city wonderful. And to me, that's what's really important. We need to maintain a great diversity of wildlife, not only birds, but lots of other wildlife here. And we need to behave in ways that allows these species to be moderately successful, not super abundant and successful where they turn people off, not so rare that we have to pay incredible costs to conserve them for legal issues, but moderately available, moderately abundant, and a great variety of them. If you want more information from the talk that I gave, you can get it on our website there. Otherwise, I would thank you for your attention for such a long time.